So, here we are, Sunday morning for our spiritual practice. Are you ready? Got maybe a surprise or two in store for this morning. Maybe a surprise or two. So, your life, my life, this life. My grandmother just turned 98. So she's going to be living out her 99th year, right? Betty White, right? 99 years she had. She almost made it to her 100-year birthday. She actually pre-recorded a little mini hello for her 100th birthday. What do we do with our 100 years? What do we do? What kind of impact can 100 years have? 100 years. There's a saying, and I don't have it exact, but essentially the saying is that you die twice. You die the first time when you, as we would say in Unity, lift in, or as I would say in Unity, lift into your freedom form. We make our transition. And then the second death is the last time your name is mentioned on the planet. The last time your name leaves lips. So your descendants and those who have learned from you or cherish you, the last time that name is spoken. But we know that there's another living legacy for each one of us. And that's the gift of love that is nameless. That's the spirit that we not only embody, but that we give and we share, that we live with, that we teach with, that expresses the spirit we know as God and can call by any name or no name. One of my favorite musicians and singer-songwriters, you might know of him, wrote a song called 100 Years. That's Crazy Carl. If anyone knows Crazy Carl, who's here as part of our spiritual community, he wrote this gorgeous song called 100 Years. And in that song, he talks about what we'll leave our children's children, what will we leave to future generations. And he goes about saying that 100 years ago, none of us were here. And in 100 years, none of us will be here. Can you feel that for a second? Just feel it for a second. In 100 years, we won't be physically here, for sure. Well, there could be a very little one somewhere. So how can we use our spiritual practice to inform our lives so that we are on purpose, that we are mindful, that we are intentional, that we are living the life that is ours to live, and not living someone else's idea of the life we should be living, or going by someone else's pace in life, or following someone else's rules and ideas of what we should be and how we should live. This is ours to create, right? We're unique, unrepeatable expressions of the divine. And it is for each of us to look at how we want to be from moment to moment. And sometimes we take that and we call it life and we call it 100 years and it gets so big. But the truth is it's one moment. It is one moment constantly lived. That's it. It's one moment constantly lived. So what are we going to do with our 100 years? Let's just take a look back a little bit. Martin Luther King would have been 93 on this birthday. He would have been 93. Think about in the small period of time that he was on the planet, what an impact he had, the living legacy he left. Life expectancy 100 years ago was shorter. Do you want to guess what it was? Life expectancy for men and women 100 years ago. So Betty White just about made it to 100. That's happening more and more frequently. But 100 years ago, the life expectancy for women was 54.6 years old. And for men, In 1920, around 53.6 years old. So about 54 years old. So how many of us are living on borrowed time when it comes to 100 years ago, right? You're living your second. You guys are like cats. Meow. Living life after life. So what are we going to do with this extra gift of time? It's this one moment lived continually over and over again. Are we going to spend it getting consumed by the world around us? Are we going to spend it watching Netflix and videos? Maybe some of it, maybe a bit of it. But can we spend it in peace in each moment? You know who else made their transition yesterday? Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh made his transition just yesterday. The Buddhist spiritual leader, the Zen master, he passed away at the age of 95. He spent a lifetime teaching engaged Buddhism, which is focused on actively facilitating change and awakening and mindfulness. For the collective, to benefit all of humanity. And his key teachings were that through mindfulness, we can live happily in the present moment. And that's the only way to develop true peace, is to begin within ourselves and allow that to spread to the world outside of ourselves. The master teacher taught that same lesson, no? Go within, have peace within, that the transformation happens within, that you do not have to wait for the world around you to catch up. So we're living on borrowed time. We're living on extra time. We're living each moment, this one moment, for an unknown number of years. What are we going to do with it? Let's take another look back 100 years ago. 100 years ago, guess what? They were just coming out of a pandemic. 100 years ago. The world was just coming out of the greatest pandemic it had seen, with the flu that infected almost 30% of the world's population, and they think may have killed around 50 million people. So 100 years ago, there was struggle, right? Today there's struggle. Women had been just given the right to vote, had just fought for the right to vote 100 years ago, and prohibition had just started. Another interesting experience for a lot of people in that time. To some people, I'm sure they thought the world was over. Think about what's happened in the last 100 years. A lot of wars, a lot of financial struggle, collapses, building and then collapses, depressions. Life. A lot of life happened in 100 years. I want to share with you a little bit from a book that was just gifted to me by Alicia Dwyer, who many of you know. She ran the bookstore for years and years here at Unity Village. So she had some treasures, and she, from time to time, passes those treasures on to me. And this is just a little workbook put together from the Silent Unity Telephone Prayer Ministry, and it's called Soaked in Spirit, and it was researched and compiled by Winfred Hall. And I learned a few things I didn't know about the Fillmores and what preceded their 100 years of ministry and birthing unity. It says that Kansas City was ripe for visionaries when they arrived. It talks about it being an explosive time of growth, that the population in 1865 was about 3,500 people. And by 1870, it grew ninefold to 32,000 people. In 1889, it said with a population of 130,000, the city adopted a new charter and changed its name to Kansas City. it talks about, I think it's on a different page, it talks about, somewhere in here, it talks about the incredible, because Charles Fillmore, for any of you that don't know, Charles Fillmore was in real estate. That was one of the things he was in before being a spiritual leader of the Unity movement. He was in real estate, and so that was one of the reasons why he came. It was a great opportunity to come. And it says in here that in Kansas City, they were buying and selling businesses and buildings, sometimes multiple times in a day for a profit. So someone would buy it, someone else would sell it, someone would buy it, someone would sell it, multiple times in a day. So he came here when it was a time of great growth. And there are a few other interesting tidbits in looking at his history. You might think that Charles and Myrtle, if you know anything about Unity's co-founders, are quite interesting people. But if you look at their story, you might think that, they were prosperous folks that had some great spiritual ideas and wanted to share them with others, and bought this land here in Kansas City, in the greater Kansas City area, and just had a good life. But they had a lot of interesting struggles. They had a lot of life happen to them. And in the midst of that life, they stayed true to their spiritual practice and their spiritual path. And they birthed what we now all experience today as this unity movement. Georgiana, who was Charles Fillmore's mom, said it said that she would often relate to Charles a kidnapping experience when he was a child in the wilderness. So his father was a trader. He would trade with the Native Americans up in Minnesota. And a lot of times his mother would be left alone with Charles and his younger brother, who was 2 years younger than him. And Charles Fillmore said, "My mom often told us of her hair-raising experiences alone much of the time among roving bands of Chippewa and Sioux Indians. One day, when my father had gone to another trading post on the east side of the Mississippi River, she was alone in the cabin. A band of Sioux dashed up, grabbed me out of her arms, and rode off." Imagine that for a second. Little boo-boo Fillmore. She was, of course, nearly distracted, but could do nothing. Get this. At sundown, they brought me back unharmed. At sundown, they brought me back unharmed. He said, "Such incidents made my early years romantic, but crude and unprofitable." Charles later reported, and just check into your mind and see if you had this thought before I say it. Just think about this for a second. He was taken for a day by the Native Americans in the area and then returned. Charles Fillmore, think about what comes to your mind. He later reported that he always felt he was used in some sort of religious ceremony by the tribe. So was he kidnapped or did he get a baby blessing? When Charles was 7, his parents separated. Now think about that at that time, right? It's not a time when separating was easy. It's not a time when separating was common in the way it is today. And where they lived was a tricky place to live. It says that Mary Charles and his brother Norton, 2 years younger, managed to survive on their own. But Charles's brother Norton ran away from home, never to return to the bleakness that was St. Cloud, Minnesota, when Charles was about 12. Do that math. That means his brother ran away at 10 years old in the wilderness of Minnesota, never to return. That brought Charles and his mother, Georgiana, close together, and they supported each other. Charles, when he was in Colorado, because he was also a real estate agent in Colorado, he worked with the, and I didn't know this part, I've always heard about Myrtle going to a talk and hearing, "I'm a child of God, therefore I do not inherit disease." And that's how she began her healing journey. But even before this, it says in Pueblo, Colorado, Charles had been in the same real estate firm as James Small. James was married to Aletha Brooks, one of the three Brooks sisters, Nona, Franny, and Aletha. If you know any New Thought history, you know that that's the beginning of divine science, another spiritual movement based in New Thought. So the Brooks sisters were an early influence, clearly, on the Fillmores. It was in these early years, it says, that they were in the same line of thinking of truth, the principle of the omnipresence of God. The Brooks sisters attended a class taught by Emma Curtis Hopkins in Denver, Colorado. On the third day of class, Nona was healed of a severe throat ailment. And when they talk about ailments these days, I'll read a little bit more. They're not just talking about a little bit of tuberculosis or a sore throat or a little bit of a hurt leg. If you know anything about Charles Fillmore, he had a leg that had some trouble. So let's go on to see what else happened in the Fillmores' 100 years. Myrtle said that she sees her spirituality like this. She said, "I am decidedly eclectic in my theology." I am decidedly eclectic in my theology. So when Charles was 10 years old, he was in a skating accident. That was in 1864. His hip was dislocated. At the age of 10, Charles dislocated his hip while skating and was confined to his home. Doctors diagnosed rheumatism in the right leg, which gradually developed into tuberculosis of the hip. Many abscesses penetrated the bones of both legs and eventually both arms as well. I knew that he had a short leg. He was treated for rheumatism. There was no improvement. Instead, the leg grew steadily worse. A succession of doctors produced a succession of diagnoses, but no improvement in the patient. In the words of Charles Fillmore himself, "I was bled, leeched, cupped, lanced, seasoned, blistered, and rolled." ROWELED. 6 running sores were artificially produced on my leg to draw out the disease condition that was presumed to be within. Physicians of different schools were employed, and the last one always wondered how I ever pulled through alive under the treatment of the quack that preceded him. As I look back on it now, it's a miracle to me how I ever got away from them all with the little bundle of bones and sinews that I found in my possession after they had finished their experiments. By that time, his hip socket had been destroyed. The leg had stopped growing and could not be moved, leaving him with a withered leg. Goes on to talk about Myrtle. Many people know Myrtle's story with tuberculosis. And she said that during my childhood, there was no real understanding of God as the health of his people. So I did not know how to disconnect myself from the hereditary thought of weakness. And she talks about that being something that was in her family. It says that in 1886, her condition had deteriorated so much that they were considering moving back to Colorado where the weather was better for her health. So it must have been still pretty humid in Kansas City. Just kidding. Hot and humid in Kansas City. But they were getting ready to move back. And at that time, this is something that's also probably not well known. You know, we hear about Myrtle getting this idea that I am a child of the divine, I'm a child of the source. The source is my wholeness, and that is my conscious birthright and my conscious destiny. And I focus on that truth, and I tell that truth, I speak that truth to every cell, every muscle, every tendon, every tissue, every bone in my body as I call it forth. But what you might not know is this. At that time, Myrtle had great faith in medicine and tried all sorts of medical remedies. Her son Lowell recalls the medicine cabinet was always full to overflowing with pills and serums with which she was continually diagnosing herself and all of the other members of the family. But doctors told her that if she remained in Kansas City, she would probably only have a short time to live, that there was nothing they could do for her. And also at the time, Charles had lost a fortune of $150,000 in the collapse of the real estate boom. That had to be a lot of money back then. As they were in the midst of discussing a move back to Colorado, Charles had a dream that cemented their staying in Kansas City. They stayed in Kansas City because Charles had this momentous dream, recalling an unseen voice said, "Follow me." And I was led up and down the hilly streets of Kansas City, and my attention was called to localities that I am familiar with. The presence stopped and said, "You will remember having had a dream some years ago in which you were shown this city and told you had work to do here. Now you're being reminded of that dream and also informed that the invisible power that has located you will continue to be with you in your appointed work." He said, "When I awoke, I remembered that I had such a dream and forgot it. And then we made Kansas City our permanent home." And what he later said about Kansas City was this. He said, "A particular psychic atmosphere prevails here, and it is clear to everyone who has made any attainments whatever in the unfoldment of the Spirit. Metaphysicians from all parts of the country have sensed it and observed its harmonious effects upon them. They have a sense of freedom and peace which they do not feel elsewhere." That wasn't the end of their struggles. They lost a son. They lost a daughter-in-law who had just given birth. They lost a son at a young age in his 30s. So they had quite a bit of struggle, right? And then think about the time periods that they lived through. But what got them through was following their guidance, following their intuition, and listening. And Myrtle got this divine idea of her wholeness. Charles had dreams and followed his intuition. They both followed the spiritual gifts that were given to them. They followed them, they listened, they trusted, they moved forward, and they practiced the presence. Clearly, at any point, they could have decided, "It's too much, we can't go on, I can't handle this." Imagine growing Unity Village at a time of the Depression, at a time of struggle, at a time of financial struggle. But guess what, friends? Unity Village Chapel has now been on grounds for 100 years. This is our 100-year anniversary. 1922. 1922. And we are here because of the living legacy that went before us. We're here because of intuition, because of healing, because of prayer, because of a beautiful energy of wholeness that was shared and given to so many, to anyone with ears to hear. In that book, it goes on to talking a lot about the telephone. The telephone was just coming out, and they're installing them. They're very excited. The radio broadcasted its first talk in the early 20s. So there was a lot that was exciting going on, and there was also a lot of struggle. And isn't that always the story? Thich Nhat Hanh lived an incredible nearly 100 years. Martin Luther King lived less, but his legacy lived more. The master teacher. All of life has its yin and yang. All of life has its struggle and its triumph, its good times and its really difficult times. What we love through, what we live through. Think about what this movement has lived through. Think about every year. Think about what you know that has happened in history. And then think about what you are living through and what you are living with. Think about what Unity Village Chapel will live through. One of New Thought's great leaders from Center for Spiritual Living, like Fillmore at the time, was Ernest Holmes. And Ernest Holmes says, "I am guided by the same intelligence and inspired by the same imagination which scatters the moonbeams across the waves and holds the forces of nature in its grasp." I am guided by the same intelligence and inspired by the same imagination, which scatters the moonbeams across the waves and holds the forces of nature in its grasps. He says, since the only life you can have is the life of the Spirit within you, you need but permit its radiance to flow through your thought into self-expression. You are surrounded by a dynamic force, a great surge of living power. You are immersed in and saturated with the vital essence of life. Its presence permeates everything, binding all together in one complete whole. This is our practice. This is our foundation. This is our unity principle. Unity came together with the name unity because it pulled from all of the greatest teachings anyone could look into or research or learn about, and it pulled them together. It also managed to pull them together in a way that had enough freedom for people to experience it for themselves and not feel like they are being talked to or formed into something, but that they had the freedom within unity to follow their own heart, their guidance, and to experience the journey of their spiritual practice. I couldn't talk about unity having a 100-year anniversary without sharing from Sig Paulson. Many of you know he's one of my unity favorites. So as we christen this 100-year anniversary for Unity Village Chapel, let's allow this year to be meaningful for each one of us as individuals and for all of us as a collective. Sig Paulson says this: the freedom of humanity cannot come through institutions and organizations. It must come through the awakening and unfoldment of each individual. Institutions and organizations can encourage and inspire the individual growth through their activities. Or, as has happened so often in the past, they can stifle and suppress it. In the long look of eternity, even the darkness, bigotry, and suppression tactics of organized society will prove to have been factors in individual unfoldment because the pressures they have enforced on the man spirit are finally forcing it to move toward eventual freedom. He says, in the age of enlightenment, institutions and organizations will become what they are in the divine design, instruments of service, through which the unfolding self of humanity finds greater opportunities to serve. Then he goes on to talk about each one of us. So that's the organization. The organization comes to life only to the degree that the individuals within it come to life. And he says, this is not about getting ourselves out of the way. Each person is to be the way. To be the way word becomes flesh, or to phrase it another way, to be the way the light shines into the world. Would you take a breath with me to breathe in these affirmations from Sig Paulson? If you feel like closing your eyes, feel free to do so. At long last, I accept myself as a permanent and vital part of the creative process of the universe. I am old enough and young enough right now to release all the images that have limited my capacity for self-expression. With a growing sense of authority and conviction, I reject and eject all inferior pictures from my imagination chamber. I joyously exercise the inner authority that is mine as a self-expression of the infinite. Amen? So what do we do in our time? What do we do not with the whole of the 100 years, but the one moment that we may be gifted to live as long as we are in these bodies in this time. Pray for others. Pray and support others. That's what all great spiritual seekers and spiritual leaders have done. Contribute to something greater than yourself. Can we each get in alignment with contributing to something that is greater than ourselves? Contribute to what we value and what we want to see endure through time. So if that's Unity Village Chapel, it's here. If it's something else, it's there. Contribute to what we want to see thrive. And then leave and live a legacy. Leave and live a legacy in each moment. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "Please do not build a stupa for me. Please do not put my ashes in a vase, lock me inside, and limit who I am. I know this will be difficult for some of you. If you must build a stupa, though, please make sure that you put a sign on it that says, 'I am not in here.'" In addition, you can also put another sign on it that says, "I am not out there either." And a third sign that says, "If I am anywhere, it is in your mindful breathing and your peaceful steps." So let's breathe into a time of meditation together. Just allowing ourselves to take that in. Mindful breathing, peaceful steps. Mindful breathing, peaceful steps. Mindful breathing, peaceful steps. I step in to what is mine to be in each moment. I allow myself freedom from thoughts that I need to struggle or try or create my impact. And I recognize the practice in each moment, having my full attention and intention is more than enough. It is my living legacy. In this present moment awareness, I am guided to all that is mine to do, to be, to think, to give, to share. From the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, take my hand, we will walk, we will only walk. We will enjoy our walk without thinking or arriving anywhere. Breathing in, I am aware that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I am aware that I am breathing out. Breathing in, I am grateful for this moment. Breathing out, I smile. Breathing in, I am aware of the preciousness of this day. Breathing out, I vow to live deeply in this day. We are grateful for the legacy of prayer that we live into, reminding us that prayer is affirmation. It's not to change the mind of a far-off deity or a man in the sky. It's to align our thoughts and our emotions with the absolute presence of divine mind, the wholeness, the love, and the wisdom available. We breathe in gratitude for the legacy of visualization, knowing that we co-create through the pictures we have in our minds, through the thought, emotional field that we experience, that we generate, and that this practice we are co-creative beings. We breathe in gratitude for a practice that directs each one of us to go to headquarters within, the spirit within, for our guidance, our insight, our grounding. We breathe in gratitude for the living legacy demonstrated by so many of their physical wholeness through this spiritual practice. Grateful for the gifts passed down, the healings demonstrated, the wellness experienced. In the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, you are like a candle. Imagine you are sending light out all around you. All your words, thoughts, and actions are going in many directions. We are transforming and continuing in a different form at every moment. And so it is. Namaste.